Dark Souls may have been the first From Software game I played, but it was Dark Souls 3 that really hooked me into this series, and the big reason why is the increase in the quality of boss fights. Dark Souls 3 has one of my favorite boss rosters in gaming, with almost every fight being consistently phenomenal. The roster shrank back down significantly after the last couple of games, dropping back to 25 bosses, maybe 26 depending on if you count the two versions of Halflight as different bosses. And there are so many legendary fights in this game. So, without further ado, let's dive into the boss extravaganza that is Dark Souls 3. Immediately out of the gate, the tutorial puts players against Iudex Gundyr. Similar to the Asylum Demon, Iudex Gundyr blocks player progression past the tutorial. You can't change your weapons, armor, estus, or upgrade anything until you've shown enough understanding of basic mechanics that you can beat the Iudex, which also means Judge, making his role in the game pretty clear. Unlike the Asylum Demon, which was designed to be empowering for a new player as you got a huge damage boost with your weapon and a free chunk of health removed via the plunging attack, Iudex Gundyr is much more intricate and demanding of a new player. You need to time your rolls, position yourself away from his grabs, and there's no way around it. To beat Iudex Gundyr, you have to show Dark Souls you understand the basics. The first phase is simple, moving with enough intent to introduce the game's faster pace while still not overwhelming a new player. The long glaive is a great choice for a weapon here, as the animations make each attack's arc crystal clear. There's some really strong posing happening with Iudex Gundyr, and it makes him easier to predict. The windups don't ever try to trick the player, with the only real gotcha moment being a quick punch with his offhand to interrupt you out of a greedy attack, but it also doesn't deal much damage. There's a solid, dangerous moveset here, yes, but the game intentionally keeps damage on the lower side to stop the tutorial from becoming a brick wall. It's an artfully well done early game boss in a series well known for its difficulty. It serves as an accomplishment for new players while still having enough depth to be mastered by veterans. I've seen people who've never played a Souls game before take 10 or 20 attempts to fight the Iudex, and watching that feeling of success when they finally manage to time that dodge roll, or finally punish those longer attacks, it's something incredibly special most games could never even dream of pulling off, much less against the first boss in the game. I also think it's emblematic of Dark Souls 3's more accessible intent than previous games. People can love the aesthetic of Bloodborne, but running out of blood vials as they try to get past that first big group of mobs can be really disheartening. Iudex Gundyr makes people feel like they're good enough to beat the game. After all, he feels so immediately overwhelming, but the complexity hides a boss simple enough to guard a tutorial. With that said, his second phase definitely loses some momentum. The transformation itself does do a great job shocking the player and setting up later enemies, but the moveset doesn't do nearly as well. It's a little too large for the camera, and the moves all look a little samey compared to the clear animations of the first phase. It's not bad, but it is the one place the fight stumbles. Even with that, Iudex Gundyr still deserves an A grade. Though his second phase leaves a bit to be desired, his first phase is picture-perfect how to execute a tutorial boss in this genre of action games, showing the level of boss polish encounters in this game try to consistently reach. Vordt of the Boreal Valley is the next boss players will usually run into, and continues trying to raise the stakes, boasting the first cutscene in the game. Vordt starts a bit of a trend in this game's cutscenes. The main character wants to touch something, and the boss gets upset about it. In this case, it's a door. It does lead to a fun switch-up the first time entering the fight, where you'll start the battle on the far side of the arena rather than the entrance. Now, there's not a real difference due to the arena just being a rectangle, but it is a cool detail that helps make Vordt feel like the watchdog he is. In terms of design, Vordt is a mix between a beast and a knight with a mace. Though he swings the mace like any knight that you've seen so far would, he also boasts slams, spins, and a frost breath attack. Now, I'd show you some specific footage of his diverse moveset, but Vordt has a major design flaw. Namely, he can't do anything to someone standing behind him. Since behind him is the easiest place to deal damage, most of this boss's moveset goes tragically unused. He does try to hop away, but he's pretty easy to follow and just roll back underneath again. His health is high enough to encourage you to upgrade your weapon or utilize the gold pine resin in the prior area, but not so high that he feels unbeatable without upgrading your weapon, which fits his role nicely as the first non-tutorial boss. That said, Vordt's second phase brings the fight home much better than Iudex Gundyr's. One pattern in Dark Souls 3 is that From Software heard that people liked two-phase boss fights, and so now everything has two phases. Out of a roster of 25, 3.5 bosses, that half will make sense when we get there, don't have a second phase. That means 21 of the bosses have a second phase, or potentially even a third. Iudex Gundyr's was not subtle, completely changing part of his moveset, and Vordt's follows suit without being quite as hard on the camera. Vordt smashes his mace into the ground, does a massive howl, and the music goes absolutely wild as he uses a triple charge attack that can potentially one-shot a player if they haven't figured out rolling yet. His Frost Breath becomes more potent, covering more area and inflicting the new Frostbite status affliction, lowering a player's stamina regeneration, which makes rolling and following him more difficult. The music, combined with the charge, is terrifying to a new player, but incredibly satisfying to roll through and punish. After his buff, all his attacks do more damage, and he can pull that new triple charge and Frost Breath out again, but the rest of the boss stays functionally the same. Vordt may be a simple fight, but I think he earns a B grade. Though his struggle to hit something behind him holds him back significantly, the combination of his second phase and the music still makes him an exciting enemy to face. For anyone who likes this series of analysis videos more when I'm upset at the game, don't worry, even a game with as solid of a roster as Dark Souls 3 still makes some missteps. The first of these missteps is the curse-rotted Greatwood. The Greatwood starts with a horde of mobs, which isn't actually as bad as it sounds. All the undead settlement enemies are staggered whenever a player rolls into them, which makes getting overwhelmed rare. On top of that, the mobs also take damage from the Greatwood's attacks, and they have a low enough health that one attack from the boss usually takes them down. The boss is also large enough that almost any of its attacks will usually hit at least one villager. However, that brings us directly to the first issue. This thing is massive, and the few moves that it has that would be satisfying to dodge often have tells that happen off-screen, so all the player sees is the Greatwood flailing around. The Greatwood moves enough that the few weak places that you need to hit often move away suddenly, which ends up being more of a frustrating inconvenience than actually difficult. The only well-telegraphed moves are the Greatwood's Get Off of Me attacks, dropping pus sacks from its branches, lifting itself up and slamming down, things like that. Now, being forced off a large boss isn't bad. In fact, it's a core part of a large boss's moveset, how does it get back to a neutral state with the player. But when everything this boss does is either move the weak spot away or force you to move away from the weak spot, it gets old fast. To damage the Greatwood, you have to attack these vulnerable pus sacks. Some of these are fine to hit, like its backhand and groin area. Small tangent, this fight is absolutely disgusting. But others are out of reach with certain weapons, and if you haven't done enough damage on the easy-to-hit sacks before they break, the fight often becomes waiting for the Greatwood to do its attacks that move weak points into range so you can hit them. This mostly rears its head in the second phase once you're almost out of pus sacks to attack. For that second phase, the Greatwood does a massive slam that breaks the ground, dropping you both into a pit. The mobs die and a giant arm breaks out of the tree to attack you. This arm can take damage, and more pus sacks do become revealed, but even with that, the second phase doesn't quite work. The fall seems initially impressive, but feels stiff. The enemies taking fall damage, but the player not, has always felt strange to me, and everyone just kinda T-poses as they drop. The Greatwood does have more active attacks down here, and its standing and belly flopping are more visually impressive than its prior attacks, but it's still just dull. You're waiting for it to move just so you can land a couple of hits, and all of the attacks take so long. I love the idea of incorporating multiple weak points that need to be targeted, but the weak points often being inaccessible based on random chance, or forcing the player to utilize a very specific strategy that relies on knowing when, where, and how staggers will happen feels like something that misses the point of this good gimmick. The boss doesn't feel like it's reacting to you, and the player doesn't have enough options to overcome minor verticality. I think that if this boss was an Elden Ring, it could work significantly better, because a jump button would make this design much more engaging. Despite its failures, it still earns a D grade. The fight is disappointing, yes, but it's not broken. The only thing about this fight that would fully earn an F grade is the music, which is my least favorite track in Dark Souls 3, and a contender for my least favorite in the series. It feels like someone fell on an organ, which I suppose does work for a tree that attacks by falling on you. This is now the 4th video where I go on about my opinions and ideas about game design. There have been plenty of hot takes. Bosses I love the community hates, bosses I hate that the community loves, but this might be the hottest take in the whole series. After so many playthroughs, so many challenge runs, and even learning the all bosses speedrun, I consider the Crystal Sages the second hardest boss fight in Dark Souls 3. The first phase of the fight is a pushover. The Sage's spells are often slow-moving, never catch you off guard, and his teleport is slow enough that it's easy to quickly rack up damage. If it was just this phase, he'd possibly be the easiest boss in the game. But when the second phase hits, he starts to summon 6 to 8 versions of himself that can all attack with full power, and only one actually takes damage, revealed to the player based on the color of the spells that the Sage is casting. The frustrating thing is that I feel like this fight should not be this hard, but the Sages do a ton of damage, and if you're unlucky and 2 of the off-screen Sages decide to do a fast attack at the same time, you can drop instantly. Outside of my level 1 playthrough, this is the only boss in the game I've regularly been one-shot by, and I cannot figure out how to dodge some combos of its attacks. I either get through this fight taking little to no damage, or I get absolutely blasted. The Sage becomes a standard enemy later in the game, combining its unique array of spells with the environment, and frankly, I wish the boss fight went into that idea. When it comes to bosses where navigating their arena is the core of the battle, a boss like the Sages who can teleport and cast spells from a distance works really well for keeping the tension up. That sentence is a little foreshadowing, by the way, but we'll get to that. The spells themselves are solid. They're all visually distinct, covering different areas in interesting ways. A line on the ground, a slow-moving projectile, a soul arrow, or a homing soul mass that traps the Sage in place. It's a nice array of moves. They just don't overlap well with each other. But as a spellcaster foe individually, or even combined with an area, it's really well made. It's hard to grade the Sage because though I love their moveset, their fight oscillates wildly between being a pushover and a brutal onslaught. The Sage cloning itself is intimidating, yes, but waiting for the Sage to reappear is often boring. It becomes a battle of contradictions. Unless, of course, you're over-leveled, in which case they're helpless and occasionally dead before the second phase. Overall, I'd give the Sage a C grade. When the fight is at its most aggressive, it feels like it goes too far, but when the Sage is agreeable, it serves as a fun evolution of earlier boss fights like Pinwheel and the Fool's Idol. With a little more polish, I could see myself really loving this fight, but it doesn't do it for me as it stands. When Dark Souls 3 released, the Deacons of the Deep were considered to be the easiest boss in the game, frequently easy enough to barely pose a threat to a properly leveled player. But that's the catch, to a properly leveled player. In challenge runs where I wasn't properly leveled or I was using a specific damage type, the Deacons pose a substantial threat, and I started to see why they were designed the way they were. Now before I should get into that threat, I should run over the fight itself. One Deacon is possessed. When it dies, the main health bar takes damage, and a new Deacon becomes possessed. None of these Deacons can output any significant damage, and all of them stagger from even dagger swings. Once enough of the possessed Deacons are killed, the High Deacon appears, and you wail on him to finish the fight. He's not a physical threat, though his bodyguards are a little tougher to stagger, and have some area spells that can knock you down, making it easier to be swarmed. The real threat, though, is once you reach the second phase, the Deacons start to cast a spell together that builds up a curse. When the curse meter is full, you die. Because of this, I think that the Deacons were meant to be a damage test. Can you kill a usually unthreatening boss before it uses an instant kill move on you? Now the only issue is that the Crystal Sage kinda just did that better on the way to the Deacons. Not well, I should say, but definitely better. The more damage you do, the less teleports you have to handle, so the easier claiming victory is. And compared to other iconic damage tests within the series, like the Four Kings, who tested your damage through endurance and skill, the Deacons feel hollow. They technically do their job before you get into Irithyll, but you never feel a sense of urgency except for the very end of the battle. In theory, tension should escalate steadily throughout the encounter on a normal boss fight. There are always exceptions, rather than start at next to nothing and then spike suddenly just as you're about to die. I'd personally give the Deacons a D grade. There is enough creativity to their design that they're more entertaining than similar threats like the Royal Rat Vanguard, and they can be a decent challenge on harder runs where your damage is limited, but their simplistic design just doesn't stand up to deep scrutiny compared to other bosses within the series. I'm of the opinion that the weakest part of Dark Souls 3's boss roster is its early game. There are a few solid fights, but battles like the Greatwood, Crystal Sage, and Deacons aren't what make me excited to dive into another playthrough. And though Iudex Gundyr and Vordt are great, Iudex's position as a tutorial boss makes him not carry the punch you're looking for as you replay the game. The first point in the game that always sells me on my playthrough of Dark Souls 3 is the first of the 4 Lords of Cinder, the Abyss Watchers. There are a lot of bosses that I've mentioned that have really interesting gimmick concepts that don't quite land. Unique ideas that break the mold of an encounter can more often than not end up taking too much away from the gameplay depth without adding enough to justify their inclusion within the game. The Abyss Watchers are the most successful gimmick boss up to this point in the series, because though the gameplay does suffer a little, the primary gimmick of the Abyss Watchers adds a ridiculous amount of atmosphere. In the opening cutscene, you watch as the main Abyss Watcher kills one of the other Abyss Watchers. And as the Abyss Watcher notices you, he gives you a salute and prepares for battle. It's an effective cutscene and builds into the Watcher's gorgeous music in a great way. The Abyss Watchers are molded off of Artorias, but with speed and mobility over Artorias' durability. They slide across the ground, do these quick offhand attacks, and frequently show off acrobatic spins and dives. It's a detailed moveset that, combined with the lore importance they were given by the opening cutscene, makes it clear that you've left the early game. After a short time fighting the Watcher, a bell rings and another Abyss Watcher rises to join the fight. This one isn't tied to the main health bar, it has its own health bar and joins in against you. The damage you can be intimidating and attacking is incredibly difficult. After all, there are 2 bosses rushing at you full speed. That is, until the bell rings again, and a 3rd Abyss Watcher arrives. This Abyss Watcher is on nobody's side. He'll attack whoever is closest to you or the other Watchers. Suddenly, the tragedy of the fate of this lord is made painfully clear, and the music builds amazingly to this climax. This is their reality, consumed by their madness, rising from the dead and killing themselves over and over and over again. You work alongside this berserk red-eyed Watcher to take down the main boss. Now, there are a couple issues in this phase. Since the best way to deal with the second Watcher is to dodge until you have an ally, you're never really forced to engage with the chaos beyond knowing when to attack and when to run and wait for a mob to come and help you. The red-eyed Watcher can also choose to focus on you, which can lead to 3 bosses attacking you at once, and that obviously gets frustrating fast. With that said, this isn't the whole fight, it's just the introduction to the fight. The Abyss Watcher absorbs the blood of the other felled Watchers and rises up, and also he is on fire now, which is going to be a recurring theme in this game, so get used to that. His movement speeds up, his AI focuses more on single target attacks, and he becomes even more acrobatic and cinematic, gaining these fire after effects to up the stakes. The fight masterfully evolves the moveset from an atmospheric, chaotic mess to a precise one-on-one battle without dropping a single beat. I have heard people argue that the Abyss Watchers need more health, and yeah. I understand why they kept the health where they did, since the Watchers can be fought immediately after Vordt as the 3rd boss in the roster, but players would need to walk past the Greatwood and avoid the Sage in order to trudge into a brutal poison swamp containing some of the most lethal enemies in the game before seeing a boss from the intro cutscene. I feel a new player would think, wow, maybe I should do something else first. I've been talking the Abyss Watchers up pretty significantly, but that occasional AI lapse in Phase 1 can definitely rob some of the atmosphere, and that health issue rears its head pretty significantly on later playthroughs once you know what you're doing. It's hard to be drawn into the atmosphere of the fight when you're dropping the Watcher in 6 hits, or in my case, making sure I don't upgrade my weapon with materials and souls I had by doing other content first. Overall, I'd still give the Watchers a high A grade. But they're just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the second half of this game. From here, Dark Souls 3 really starts to get rolling. But first, it does have to hit rock bottom. High Lord Wolnir has one thing going for it, and that's design. You touch a cup, that is consequences from touching things number 2, and then you pick up a book, you absolute buffoon, and you get attacked by a spooky skeleton in a dark nightmare void. Wolnir has 3 bracelets, attack them enough, and they each break, and when they're broken, he's dead. That's right, Wolnir is the first of those 3.5 bosses without a second phase. Well, he can technically draw a sword after you break a couple of his bracelets, but it doesn't change anything outside of instead of swinging his arm, he swings his sword now, so I personally don't count that, Suly. He'll also summon some skeletons who he'll almost immediately kill himself. The real danger within this fight that the player needs to avoid is mist. Stand in the mist, and you will take damage ridiculously fast. This wouldn't be an issue if Wolnir didn't keep his bracelet right next to the edge of the mist, and occasionally start climbing up the hill with almost no warning, or cough up mist to try to force you back. There is a wall in the arena too, which is irritating, because if he decides to climb too frequently, you can just lose the fight automatically. Now of course once you know what you're doing, you're fine and Wolnir poses little to no threat, but I have died so many stupid ways to Wolnir, and none of them have ever felt like a learning experience in the same way the best bosses do. On top of that, the fight's atmosphere fades away as the fight progresses. Though it has a great initial shock of Wolnir appearing, the lack of a second phase escalation is really felt in a game so committed to it. When you break that last bracelet and Wolnir is carried away into the abyss, you're just left with this empty feeling of, was that it? Wolnir is the first Dark Souls 3 boss that I believe earns an F grade. He isn't fun to fight even in the best of circumstances, with that one cool moment of seeing him for the first time not outweighing all the negatives of the battle itself. Instead of progressing past High Lord Wolnir, we're actually going to drop into the hidden smoldering lake, and under there is the game's first hidden boss fight against the old Demon King. Strangely enough, despite being well hidden, this fight feels unimportant among the rest of a big named and dramatic cinematic roster. Dark Souls 3 has a far more focused story, with almost every main boss being connected to a Lord of Cinder or other main boss. The old Demon King is a dying old demon in a pit filled with the bodies of his people. He is a king of corpses. This lack of flair actually creates a unique atmosphere within the game, where the old Demon King surprisingly shines by not shining. Its moveset is solid for a boss less focused on being the biggest and flashiest. It has hammer swings, flame pulses, and plenty of fire spells like combustion and meteor showers that it rains down upon you. The damage is solid and it can pose a decent threat, but it just doesn't have the same spectacle as other major bosses. Even among early game bosses, it's more understated than the entrances of Vordt or the scale of the Greatwood. There's this sense of age and loneliness in the fight that permeates the area, the music using more of a Dark Souls sound font, and even the moveset just feel dated. Intentionally, I should mention. But where this fight really steps it up for me is its second phase, which is frankly incredible. The old Demon King takes a page out of Sif's book, making its second phase easier than its first rather than increasing the challenge. Sif's was a bit more effective because dogs are cuter than this thing, but there's more precision that went into creating the old Demon King's final hurrah. He charges up what is clearly an AoE, bursts with a massive plume of flame, and that's it. He's used up everything he had left, and he tries desperately to even gather the strength to swing his hammer. Though it lacks the "oh my god, that doggy is hurt" emotion, the transition to this phase does a great job getting new players to experience it. I've seen players rushing down that last tick of health from Sif and never noticing him limping, but skipping the King's explosion is much more difficult. Making his final effort based around such an intimidating looking move does a great job making sure people see it. I really enjoy the old Demon King as a hidden boss. Other hidden bosses in the series are so massive in scale and concept. Crossbreed Priscilla, Martyr Logarius, they feel like these momentous occasions. The simplicity of the old Demon King makes it feel like you've stumbled upon this place you aren't supposed to be, this long dead era and long forgotten world. This is the Demon King reduced to a being of so little worth, so decrepit, so worn away, that the only honorific that the game would think to give him is old. From a gameplay standpoint, the old Demon King would usually be near the bottom of a B grade, but when combined with his unique atmosphere in second phase, I think he does earn an A grade. In a series with boss fights as large as Dark Souls, I think it's important to acknowledge how much skill it takes to make a boss fight feel purposefully small. But if there's any boss in this game that has absolutely zero interest in being small, that would be Pontiff Sulyvahn. There were apparently concept drafts of this game where Pontiff Sulyvahn was designed as the final boss, and looking into the lore, Sulyvahn can be directly blamed for every event that causes this mess, but I'm not going to get into that for this one. What I am going to get into is that this is the mid-game, and, well, he still feels like a final boss. He never stops attacking. He slashes, stabs, spins, uses magic bursts. He has this attack where he swings 8 times before stopping. He can be parried, and it definitely makes him easier, because if you aren't parrying or blocking, rolling through some of his attacks is a heavy order, if not impossible. In my first playthrough, I needed to summon an NPC to help with this boss because he was so aggressive that just didn't feel like a moment to pause. When you combine this with one of my favorite musical themes in the game and his incredible design, Pontiff Sulyvahn, without a single cutscene or line of dialogue, just has an incredible presence. Just look at this introduction. He slowly walks towards you, ignites his blades, and then dives forward with ridiculous speed, making this massive impact. On top of that, the second phase is incredibly flexible in terms of how the player wants to take it on, which you know I really love. Halfway through the fight, Pontiff does this burst attack where he grows a pair of wings, adding a number more cinematic attacks into his arsenal. Diving burst attacks, flying around the arena, and other abilities that close the gap quickly with huge AoE damage. Then, he uses a move to spawn a clone of himself, and his AI slows down, relying entirely on the cinematic attacks, with the clone performing the attack that he duplicates immediately after. Now this gives the player a choice: target the clone to return the Pontiff to a one-on-one fight, but in so doing speed his AI back up with all the new moves included, or leave the clone and try to target him, knowing that failing to dodge means you could potentially take 2 hits from Pontiff back to back. I mentioned this with Ornstein and Smo, but dynamic bosses that reward and punish you for the unique ways you choose to fight them are one of my favorite design decisions this series does, and the Pontiff manages to accomplish this by conjuring the threat of a dual fight while avoiding the AI overlaps that they can sometimes fall into. I just really like how this fight was executed. Pontiff Sulyvahn is in S-grade battle, which makes him the first S-grade fight in the series that uses no cutscenes or dialogue to build its atmosphere. The Pontiff's design is so well executed and works alongside the music and arena so well that it is astonishing to me that he was not designed to be in this room. Some people may not like the fact that he can be parried, but in Dark Souls 3's higher speed, I feel it's less exploitable than it was against bosses with only 2 or 3 moves like Gwyn. Dark Souls 3 is often criticized for engaging too much in fan service, and Anor Londo is a key component of that complaint. You arrive in Anor Londo, you walk the same staircases, you see the corpse of the giant blacksmith, and you climb into the Ornstein and Smo boss arena a second time. But instead of Ornstein and Smo, you're rewarded with an ooze wearing Gwendolyn's body, using attacks from other bosses in the series that he has apparently eaten. Aldrich is either the player's second or third Lord of Cinder, and to say that he is inspired by Dark Souls is a vast understatement. You fight him in the same arena as Ornstein and Smo, albeit without the full pillars. The music pulls from Dark Sun Gwendolyn's theme for its melody, and within its moveset, Aldrich uses Nito's greatsword, Priscilla's scythe, and Gwendolyn's magic. Even with that fan service, I like this fight, even standing on its own footing. Aldrich starts by using either magical attacks that track the player, or swinging his scythe and sword, which I should mention is often incredibly ineffective because if you're near him, his body is contorting and warping in such strange ways as he dives and slinks around that he can't accurately hit anything. He can also pull out a bow, creating about a second worth of arrows that you need to run away from. Once you're close to him, he's easy to punish, so he teleports away, summoning more magic and reappearing a few moments later. The timing on this is much smoother than the Crystal Sage. By the time you're looking for Aldrich, he's getting ready to pop back up, so there is a lot less waiting in this fight. The second phase cements the pattern for major required bosses that the Abyss Watchers established, but executes it without a cutscene this time. After being below half health, Aldrich will pop up from a teleport, and he's on fire now with the music intensifying. It's a really natural transition, using its time off screen to change everything out, rather than try to use a cutscene or a specific move to enhance himself. He uses more deadly magic, summons more orbs, leaves a fire trail that deals chip damage, and his most significant upgrade, the duration on his arrow attack increases significantly. Prior to the DLC, this attack was the most damage a player could be dealt by a single moment in the game. If you were hit early on by the arrows and weren't able to escape, you'd be dead. I think Aldrich is a far more successful magical boss than the Crystal Sage. Its magic is powerful enough that it does need to be respected, and it covers enough of the arena to feel like a different type of fight than a classic melee battle. Even though attacks are far more lethal and often harder to individually dodge, it's harder to be caught off guard due to the fight's pacing, stopping Aldrich from falling into the same frustration that the Sage could often create. Aldrich earns an A grade. Though he uses plenty of ideas from Dark Souls, none of the ideas feel like they overtake the core identity of the fight. With the player often being the one chasing Aldrich, the remnants of the pillars are different from the cover they were for Ornstein and Smough, and each of the repurposed attacks feel separate enough from their original sources that they feel like nods rather than a pure duplication. Yhorm is often a subject of a great deal of failed expectations. In the opening cutscene, Yhorm is built up as the Lord of Cinder you have to defeat. He's massive and he looks absolutely incredible here. Then, after you reach the profaned capital, Yhorm finally appears and he's nearly unbeatable with your usual weapons and spells. His music is epic, he does a ton of damage, it all seems great. Then you pick up the Storm Ruler, have to learn how to menu in combat, and once you learn how to use its clunky weapon art, you just hit him a few times and he dies. Now of course there is still a challenge. His damage is still really high, and using the Storm Ruler at the wrong time can easily make you vulnerable. The classic I'm on fire now second phase that all the Lords of Cinder have amplifies his damage even further, and gives him a stomp that pushes you away from under him and into what I like to call the Yhorm smacking zone. The big issue is that the fight feels linear, lacking the gravitas that the game's build-up promised. It's a similar issue to a lot of giant puzzle bosses. The Dragon God, Bed of Chaos, these large puzzle bosses that have a hard time being fun. Though Yhorm does better than these, significantly better, as there is still enough of a game here that Yhorm isn't a bad fight, it feels comparatively hollow to the other Lords of Cinder. Unless, of course, you do Siegward's questline. Yeah, that's right, we're talking about character quest lines now in this boss video. Siegward travels alongside the player for the whole game if you help him out of the dangerous situations he finds himself in. You face demons together, help him solve puzzles, and at the end, free him from prison. In that last conversation with him prior to Yhorm, he references a final promise he made to an old friend that he aims to keep. Without summoning, Siegward walks into the arena with you, carrying his own Storm Ruler, and swears to Yhorm that he will keep his promise. You can pick up the other Storm Ruler here and join him, or you can distract Yhorm while Siegward does all the damage, both of which turn into insanely satisfying battles. There is one big issue with this though. Completing Siegward's quest is really hard, if not impossible, to do blind. Assuming you even find him in the prison cells, which is hard enough on its own, you need to navigate one of the most dangerous rooms in the game to find a key you don't even know you're looking for. Without a guide, the last part of Siegward's quest is so difficult to find, it makes the cinematic aspect that gives the fight the depth it needs hidden. And that's a tragedy, because the fact that most people haven't done this fight with Siegward is a shame. On top of that, he frustratingly stays dead if he dies because, well, he's not an Ashen one. So if you spend too much time menuing or you make too many mistakes, you'll lose the emotional payoff. On top of that, and much more confusingly, if you beat Aldrich before Yhorm, beating Yhorm teleports you to the next boss fight before getting to talk to Siegward and end his questline, which, by the way, ends with you having a final drink with Siegward before he dies. If you fought Yhorm third with Siegward, you're teleported away and come back to find his corpse. It's such a bizarre design decision that personally disappoints me a lot, because Yhorm with Siegward finally comes together as a fight. With Siegward, Yhorm becomes one of the more successful experimental battles within the series, but the game doesn't land the idea. Overall, despite all this yammering, I still think Yhorm earns a C grade. Unlike other puzzle bosses in the series, Yhorm does still manage to work as a boss, engaging with the defensive gameplay enough and boasting enough atmosphere to keep him from ever being annoying. Though the lack of an emotional punch on most runs and the simplicity of the player's offense keeps him from anything higher. We are just short of halfway through the roster of bosses, and we're already at the boss who blocks entry into the late game. Technically, this boss can be fought second, right after Iudex Gundyr, by killing Emma. Otherwise, after you defeat the Abyss Watchers, Aldrich, and Yhorm, you teleport in to find Emma has been murdered, and after trying to touch something that you shouldn't for the third time in the game, the Dancer attacks. The Dancer is in contention for the most atmospheric boss in the game. Her music is ethereal with these delays on her attacks that make her feel otherworldly. The slow stalking of her unnatural legs and the color streaks left behind by her sword swings look astonishing, and the lingering hitboxes of moves like her lunge and grab mean that positioning is key here. Fighting the Dancer is, fittingly, somewhat of a dance. If you don't follow her rules, she'll tear you apart. I'm not even sure where to start with breaking down her moveset, but it works really well. Every motion feels all at once unexpected and animalistic, yet fluid and natural without a moment's hesitation or effort. At the start of her second phase, she draws a second sword and starts adding in these long spinning attacks, drawing full designs of color of orange and blue around her as these blades dance. It is a gorgeous encounter, and I cannot overstate that enough. The Dancer is one of the first bosses in the series where we need to discuss enemy timing, training the player, and how adding delays and animations can reward or punish that. Take a look at these swings from Yhorm. As you've been playing through the game, you've been instinctively trained when to dodge and when not to dodge. A player can be expected to know when this attack will come out when Yhorm raises his axe above his head. Meanwhile, when you watch the Dancer's attacks, something feels off. Each attack comes a little later than you expect, which leads to this unnatural feel transcending past the visual design and into the gameplay. Even though the movements purposely feel like they're almost designed by a different animation team, they are designed around the player, with the roll speed still perfectly locking in with the Dancer's moves once you figure out the timing of the dance. When just one or two bosses are utilizing this delay, it can set the boss apart while still keeping a universal language that keeps the rest of the game feeling fair. Once you've learned how to face the Dancer, she becomes far less intimidating, and learning this timing is why. The Dancer is another S-grade boss, as a boss that experienced players can fight early for a significant reward or as a wall to guard the endgame. The Dancer is always able to present an engaging challenge through her unique design, animations, and breathtaking visuals. Beating the Dancer allows you to get to the final required bosses of the game, but we're going to run down the optional path of Lothric Castle first, and that means coming face to face with Oceiros, the Consumed King. The first thing to say is, holy cow, I love this man's voice. The bass performance by William Houston is incredible, but the filter added on really brings it home. Just listen to his performance for a second.
Of the power of my beloved Ocelot, child of dragons. Well, I will not give him up.
On top of that, Oceiros keeps talking throughout the fight to a crying baby he seems convinced he's protecting. And this time, From Software realized their mistake with Mikolash and made the dialogue not stop you from rolling, which means the great voice acting doesn't take away from the gameplay. With that said, sad gameplay sadly isn't anything special. It's alright, but nothing to write home about. In the first phase, Oceiros has one arm constantly up holding his child Ocelot and swinging his staff with the other one. He even seems to be pulling the baby away from you, trying to keep them safe, which is a great level of animation. He has a few breath attacks, but he's not much of a threat here. The attacks come out fast, but he can't follow up on them well, making it pretty easy to escape and return to a more neutral interaction. The main threat comes from the second phase, where Oceiros realizes he's losing, and does this. Not only does this serve as an excellent climax to the vocal performance throughout the fight, but Oceiros rightfully becomes more aggressive. Also, the baby stops crying, so he might have actually just killed a baby there. He brushes across the arena, does massive spin attacks, and starts to fly around, making the fight really escalate. With that said, this moveset is a little too mobile. Oceiros moves so far with every attack that more often than not, he ends up attacking a wall or a tree as he flails around, often clipping the player with strange hitboxes and other times not damaging them despite being positioned somewhere that the player would expect to be taking damage. Rather than feeling feral, Oceiros clipping into walls and having strange hitboxes takes away from the atmosphere the fight cultivates and makes the encounter feel a little video gamey at the end. I think Oceiros still earns a C grade, namely because the atmosphere works so incredibly well, with the voice acting and design of this boss being a particular highlight of the game. Unfortunately, the simplicity of the first phase and the jankiness of the second do still hold the fight back from being anything other than alright. Remember how Iudex Gundyr's moveset was simplified and had its damage lowered to make sure he remained accessible for new players? Well, this is Champion Gundyr, who is Iudex Gundyr before he was defeated and reduced to a judge of Ashen Ones to ensure they deserved access to the Firelink Shrine, and your role here is to be the one who defeated him. The first phase of Champion Gundyr nearly matches Iudex Gundyr's first phase, albeit with the damage scaled significantly up and aggression leaving far less moments of reprieve between his attacks. The second phase is the primary difference. Gundyr's eyes go red, and the player is put face to face with one of the most aggressive bosses in the game. Gundyr becomes even faster, does more damage, and gains multiple attacks that are almost impossible to roll through. Whereas learning parries make bosses like Pontiff Sulyvahn easier, if you want to deal with Champion Gundyr, parrying is your best solution, not just a way to simplify the battle. This is an incredibly straightforward fight. There are no tricks, there are no gimmicks, and there are no shortcuts. Where Iudex Gundyr was a test of skill for new players, Champion Gundyr is a test of mastery, as you have to position, roll, and parry your way towards every window in order to come out on top. Champion Gundyr is an A-grade boss fight. He is an incredibly tightly designed boss who always ends up being a highlight of the run, and on a first playthrough, seeing how far you've come from Iudex Gundyr is clearer here than anywhere else in the run. Dragonslayer Armour serves no purpose outside of gameplay. Its job is to be an obstacle on the way to Lothric and Lorian. There is no lore beyond that this butterfly is possessing this armor. There's no build-up, there's no story significance, this is just a big night that you gotta fight. And what a fight it is. The Dragonslayer Armour uses a great axe and great shield, and though he can turtle behind that shield and ruin your speedrun, I've never found that he lingers so long as to ruin the tension in a casual run. He has massive swings, charge attacks, and this big ground slam that leaves him wide open at the cost of a ton of damage if you mistime your dodge. He's also the first boss in this series to use a fake-out stagger. He falls to one knee and then does an incredibly quick smash in front of him with the axe as he bursts back up. It makes this suit of armor feel so alive, which is ironic because he's just a suit of armor. But the moveset feels so complete and thorough that it never loses momentum. In the second phase, the butterfly starts to shoot bullets across the arena. They don't stagger the player, but the damage can certainly add up as the fight progresses. The Dragonslayer Armour keeps up its aggression throughout the whole battle, so this added environmental change is a great way to keep upping the stakes without overloading the player. The game trusts that the Dragonslayer has enough detail in its moveset to entertain, and the trust goes a long way towards making the fight stick out. All the Dragonslayer Armour aims to do is present a satisfying gameplay challenge, but it does that so well that it's definitely an A-grade boss fight. When other games had gameplay-only fights required by the main story, you had battles like Centipede Demon or Twin Dragon Riders, these late-game fights that stand in your way before the actual target. When you compare them to the Dragonslayer Armour, it is night and day in terms of the amount of details put in. But if you thought that was the end of the endgame of Dark Souls 3 knocking it out of the park, you have got the biggest thing coming yet. Lothric and Lorian are the game's final Lord of Cinder and penultimate story boss, and they carry some serious story weight that their introduction sells really well. Lothric, who carries the same name as the world you're exploring, refused to fulfill his role as a Lord of Cinder and Link the Fire, leading to the stagnation of the world and the resurrection of the other lords. And so, at the end, after hunting down each of the other lords, you're left here with Lothric and Lorian. At first, it just begins with Lorian, Lothric's older brother. Lorian is crippled. He has no use of his legs, crawling around and attacking with heavy sword swings. It would be a simple moveset, but he has to get around somehow, and the designers decided that means, as you've likely noticed, that he teleports everywhere. He starts a combo with a teleport, he teleports in the middle of his combos, he is always teleporting and almost exclusively aggressively. Occasionally he'll move away, but he stays up against you pretty frequently, which is a fun spin on teleports, as usually they work for Aldrich or Sage to run away rather than to follow you. After Lorian dies, we get a mid-fight cutscene where Lothric comes down and heals his brother, which means you now get to do the whole fight again, but Lorian is more on fire, and Lothric is casting spells at you. Do you remember those moments where Lorian used to teleport away and give you a moment? Because now, he teleports away because Lothric is casting spells at you, most of which are going to linger as Lorian teleports back in and continues attacking you, forcing the player onto the defensive really frequently throughout this fight. The brothers have separate health bars here, and the fight ends when Lothric dies. Of course, with all the teleporting, Lothric is harder to hit as he rests on Lorian's back. If Lorian goes down, the player has a moment to attack Lothric as he prepares this big burst attack that will knock players away and heal Lorian. It does a great job providing opportunities for players who have movesets that struggle to hit Lothric, like spellcasters, or players who just otherwise struggle with positioning against the boss, like me. The music also absolutely knocks it out of the park here. This is the boss that unlocks the final battle, and the music really sells that weight. The battle is terrifying. In my first playthrough, this was without a doubt the hardest boss in the main game for me to overcome. I died for weeks over and over again trying to figure out the timing behind the teleportation, but the moment you do, it becomes so satisfying to dodge and weave between those teleporting strikes. Lothric and Lorian are another S-grade boss. I can't imagine anything that could improve this battle. Their moveset, concept, story, music, everything is done perfectly right, bringing Dark Souls 3 to this incredible climax. But just a few steps away from the end of the base game, Dark Souls 3 has its greatest fumble yet. High Lord Wolnir may have completely fumbled as a boss fight, but at least it was still a boss fight. The Ancient Wyvern is a failed plunging attack tutorial posing as one of the last bosses in the base game. When you enter the arena, the Wyvern flies down and roars. Very cool dragon fight, always fun, gotta love it. Strange arena, but I'm sure the moves will be designed around it. Nope, this is just a wall with a ridiculous amount of health, even when you attack its weaker head with ranged attacks. You are supposed to run past it, run through an area filled with more basic enemies, and then land a big plunging attack to kill it in one hit. There are 3 big things that this fight fails at. Thing number 1, this arena may be designed to be run through, but it feels like a normal area with a boss theme playing. The closest thing to a memorable challenge is this mob with an axe and change, because he's the only enemy that can really threaten you, because he can, completely luck dependent, hit you off of a ladder you have to climb, bringing you into a pit of enemies and probably to your death. Again, completely luck dependent, there is very little skill involved in dodging this guy. Thing number 2, the Wyvern doesn't do anything. If you're standing somewhere long enough, he'll show up and breathe fire at you, but that doesn't add any interesting mechanics in, it just encourages you to engage even less with an already unengaging level design. I mentioned that the Sage feels built to be a hazard as you traveled through a level. This is what I'm talking about. Imagine an arena where the Sage teleported through the area after you, shooting magic and teleporting further and further, leading you into danger and other enemies you had to get past. Well, you don't have to do that, because that's called the Grand Archives, which, as an area, would have been a better boss fight than the Ancient Wyvern. That's right, I am putting the entire Grand Archives area, the whole area with all the enemies inside it, higher on the boss list than the Ancient Wyvern, because this is my list and I can do what I want. The last thing this fight does wrong is the plunging attack itself. Firstly, the Wyvern can fly, and it just stands here, right under your perch, waving its head around just enough so you occasionally miss. Why is it sitting there for you to kill it in a single hit? It ends up losing all tension, it doesn't feel like a reward for overcoming anything. To have a boss so close to the end of the game that requires so little actual interaction is a crime. The Ancient Wyvern is an F-grade boss and the worst boss in Dark Souls 3. It fails as a puzzle and serves as nothing more than a speed bump that actively encourages you to disengage with the game. But then, justifying the entire Dragon Shrine, we get the poster boy of Dark Souls 3's difficulty, at least prior to the DLC. We've seen plenty of 2-phase boss fights, but this is the first time that the phase change doesn't just mean an escalation, but instead an entirely new enemy. In the first phase, the Nameless King rides in on a drake. To reach the second phase and the real boss fight, you have to fight the King of the Storm. The mount only takes full damage on its head, but hurting the head is far easier than similar bosses like the Duke's Deer Freya or Amygdala. Long fire breath attacks leave huge windows, and every attack the Nameless King performs with his long spear leaves the King of the Storm's head low to the ground. On top of that, its health pool isn't too significant, and a stagger that isn't too hard to get will deal a ton of damage and rush the last part of the health bar. The biggest issue with this phase is, as is so common with large bosses, the camera. With the King of Storms flying around the arena so frequently, locking onto the Drake can completely freak out the camera, and the hitboxes on the fire breath are often bizarre. It's not unbearable, but the messiness of the camera leading to getting hit really matters in a fight that demands as much endurance as this. Taking half of your health from a fire breath after a messy camera made you get hit can make an otherwise fair endurance challenge feel balanced against you. And with the King of the Storm being required every single time you try this fight, those small frustrations can add up. With that said, the stagger mechanic works great here. Rewarding aggression so significantly is a really fun way to make the player feel powerful, especially considering that the second phase has absolutely no interest in making the player feel powerful at all. After the King of the Storm goes down, the Nameless King references Ornstein and Smo by stabbing the Drake and absorbing his wind powers before making a pose that people can screenshot and use for the thumbnails of their inevitable boss difficulty ranking videos, asking if the Nameless King is in fact the hardest boss fight that From Software has ever made. Personally, I don't think he quite earns that title when a third of Bloodborne's bosses one-shot endgame builds, but that might just be me. His moveset doesn't seem too tricky on the surface, but he has long range with his lunges, swipes, and slams, moves incredibly fast with dash attacks, flies around to mess with your timing, and has a solid selection of magical attacks like wind waves that stagger and force you on the defensive against heavy follow-ups, lightning bolts that he summons directly onto you, these bullet hell lightning patterns that actually work, unlike the Orphan of Kos's, all against one of the base game's largest health bars immediately after you beat a whole different boss fight. The Nameless King also follows the dancer's lead on animation delays in order to mess with the player's head, focusing on attacking with slower but uniform swings rather than attacking with the fast swings with long windups like the dancer. The Nameless King doesn't snap into attacks, so learning the dodge timing means you're learning to dodge as the attack is about to hit you, not when he starts to swing. Now that may seem straightforward, but in a game as fast-paced as Dark Souls 3, those two often blur together. The long delay on every single attack means cheeky hits or panic dodges are punished heavily, and with the length of this fight, you need to make every dodge count. I also haven't really brought up the atmosphere of the fight yet, which is also really solid. You pull the lever at the end of the area, which we call Bad Item Touch number 4, summoning a fog that changed the entire area you went through. Walking on this fog led you to this boss, and the arena looks incredible. A lot of times the experimental or impossible arenas, like the Four Kings, have issues with depth perception, but I never had an issue with that in this fight. I've definitely run into the walls a couple of times against the King of the Storm, but the arena never feels claustrophobic. It feels like a momentous hidden boss, which the Nameless King definitely is. You had to beat Oceiros, learn the emote, go back to Irithyll Dungeon and perform an emote to get into the area that you could eventually try to fight your way through up to the Nameless King. But he's a significant enough battle that it feels like it earns the complexity. The Nameless King earns an A grade. If the camera was better against the King of the Storm, I'd likely give the fight an S grade, but issues with camera and hitboxes in any part of an endurance fight means it struggles to age well. Even with that, the Nameless King certainly made an impact on From Software's game design, because in the trail of bosses that impacted Elden Ring, I think Artorias almost directly inspired the Nameless King, and the Nameless King went on to inspire a really significant amount of the design of Elden Ring, but we'll get to that in a couple more videos. Entering the first DLC, we start with what is by far the stranger of the two boss fights within it. When I mentioned that 3.5 bosses didn't have 2 phases, this is that half. When the fight starts, the Gravetender has 3 small wolves that don't respawn. Kill the wolves, and he's just a pantsless NPC with a weapon designed for PvP. And if I had a nickel for every time the most defining characteristic of a From Software boss was their lack of pants, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but why the hell does a knight protecting Artorias' grave not have any pants? Either way, dogs are irritating and no one likes them, yada yada, but wolves are always less so they're honestly fine. The Gravetender somehow turtles as much, if not more, than the Dragonslayer Armour though. The place where half a second phase comes in is that of the Greatwolf, who's been an enemy harrying you through the entire level. The Greatwolf is the real boss here, and can come in pre-damaged if you were able to beat the wolf at any of your earlier encounters. The Greatwolf is surprisingly similar to Vordt, albeit with bite attacks instead of a mace, but like Vordt, dodging through the charge and frost breath attacks to get behind him is the key to facing him down. The issue with the encounter is that the Gravetender does very little for this fight, and is the reason I count the battle as half a boss in terms of having 2 phases. The Greatwolf only has 1 phase, and the second phase the battle introduces is the Greatwolf appearing. The Gravetender may have a health bar, but unlike the King of the Storm, doesn't feel like a boss fight. To fight the real boss, you have to kill these wolves and fight an NPC, one who can decide to turtle after the Greatwolf is summoned, so that you have to fight a 2-on-1 battle. I think the Gravetender and Greatwolf only earn a D grade. The Greatwolf's moveset is too simple, matching the design of the second boss in the game, but the Gravetender is the big problem. This fight, in general, just feels unpolished compared to the other fights. The wolves and NPC just feel haphazard. But there were 2 bosses in the first DLC, and the Gravetender and Greatwolf lacked a lot of polish. Frankly, that's because every single modicum of polish in this DLC went into the encounter against Sister Friede, and it shows. There were amazing fights in the main game of Dark Souls 3, but when Sister Friede dropped, both the best and hardest boss in the game stopped being an argument for a little while. The boss fight starts with Sister Friede stopping you after you've found Father Ariandel and the heart of the painted world she's taken control over. This first phase follows the same train of logic as the best humanoid bosses in Bloodborne. It takes the base moveset of a specific weapon and then adds layers of complication upon that to make Friede feel like an advanced player character. She has incredibly fast lunges with her scythe using a frostbite weapon art that wasn't available in Dark Souls 3 but would later become accessible to the player in Elden Ring. The big twist in this phase is that she can go invisible and leap away. The player needs to watch how the snow kicks away to find where she went and punish her before she ambushes you from behind with a huge grab attack. Altogether though, the phase isn't too demanding compared to the rest of the fight. Her speed and stealth is hard to overcome without taking damage, but still feels fair each time you get hit. Once her health bar is emptied though, Father Ariandel freaks out, lights the arena on fire, and expands the wall. Friede is resurrected, they pose dramatically, and surprise, it's a 2-on-1 fight. Though overwhelming on the first couple attempts, I've always found this to be the easiest of the phases, strangely enough. Ariandel moves slowly and does a ton of damage while Friede starts to prioritize her ranged abilities, only using her scythe if forced into melee range. She also has the ability to heal herself and Ariandel, but if your damage is high enough, it ends up being an opportunity to unload on Ariandel without Friede's spells damaging your stamina bar. The two share a single health bar here, so any players who want to bait Ariandel before sprinting over to fight Friede in melee are welcome to do so. With that said, Friede's speed and agility make her hard to get damage on quite as quickly compared to the massive Ariandel who takes so long between each of his attacks. I think the most impressive part of this second phase is that it removed the elements of frustration I had with Ornstein and Smo. Ariandel has these loud sound cues whenever he starts an attack, and Friede's reliance on telegraphed spells that burst with a delay means the player is aware of what enemies are doing, allowing a more aggressive playstyle. Once you lower their shared health bar, both of them fall, and you earn a Titanite slab for your trouble. But that does not mean you are done. Did you think a 2-phase boss fight is all this DLC had for you? No, that Titanite slab was a reward for reaching the real boss for the first time. This is Black Flame Friede, and I hope you still have your healing resources, because if you don't know how to abuse backstabs here, you are in for one of the most demanding final phases of an endurance fight in the series. Black Flame Friede takes Sister Friede's moveset and dials it up to 11. Magical tracking fire across the ground after attacks, and extended reach AoE slams that put out these additional tracking attacks, diving attacks, more dodging, faster follow-ups, faster combos, longer combos, higher damage on every move. She becomes harder to stagger, she becomes more aggressive, she is a relentless foe with enough of a health bar that she could have stood on her own as a boss and still been difficult. For me, this is easily the hardest overall fight in the game. If you had a sloppy fight against Sister Friede, or you had to waste 4 Estus getting hit by Father Ariandel a couple lazy times, you really feel it in this third phase. The player's generous healing limit is pushed to the breaking point here, because you will likely need to use every resource at your disposal. I've heard people describe the battle with Black Flame Friede as a Bloodborne fight where the player is limited by the Dark Souls 3 engine's speed, but I don't think that's entirely fair. It feels like she moves faster, yes, but every action she takes was very clearly designed to match the player's moveset capabilities. Nothing is impossible to dodge, even though she feels overwhelmingly and blisteringly fast. It's fantastic. If you somehow hadn't gathered already, Sister Friede and Father Ariandel are an S-grade boss. The boss was so good that even in a disappointingly short DLC, the reviews were still positive, and many of them mentioned this boss as a justification for an entire DLC, which is absolutely insane. If bosses in Elden Ring's DLC comes close to the level of quality of the Ringed City, we will be ridiculously spoiled. I also forgot to mention, but this fight starts because you touch a bowl that you're not supposed to touch, so add that to the pile. But where Ashes of Ariandel brought only one incredible boss fight, the Ringed City DLC steps up to bat from the moment the DLC appears. The Demon Prince is one of the series' best duel fights, and is one of the reasons I was disappointed in many of Elden Ring's bosses, which feels strange, but hear me out. Phase 1 of the Demon Prince, which is the most impressive part of the fight for me, is a classic 2-on-1 fight, a genre of boss that I personally don't like. The Demon in Pain and Demon in Below are identical enemies. Their names are only there to facilitate a mechanic within the second phase, which I'll get to later. They're both incredibly aggressive melee enemies with huge health pools, and their melee AIs don't do anything to separate themselves. When both demons are running at you, getting an attack in is all but impossible. Thankfully, that's only their melee moveset AI. One demon starts with this melee moveset, and the other starts using what I'm going to start referring to as a burnt out moveset. In the burnt out moveset, the demons move slower, rarely going into melee even when you move up to them, and instead relying on a long ranged attack that inflicts the toxic condition. But this ranged attack is perfectly designed. A massive trail covers the ground and then explodes, one section at a time, pushing away from the demon. This means you're warned without needing to look at the burnt out demon, both where the attack will be going, when the attack is starting, and when the attack will hit you. It was also really clever to have this attack inflict Toxic instead of just deal damage. Toxic is an incredibly lethal status effect in an endurance battle, since the resource cost of the Toxic condition is so much higher than any standard hit could be. Because of this, even a more passive attack still poses a serious threat and must be respected, which again is a great piece of balancing design here. On the sound design aspect of things, it also serves to communicate to you when the nature of the fight is about to change, as the demons give a massive screech to signify that they've exited their burnt out mode and will be rejoining as a melee combatant. This is the one place where the fight does lose me a little bit, as the best thing to do here is to just run away for about 15 to 20 seconds. After that time, the other demon will do a massive slam that releases the fire shockwave and enter its burnt out mode, and the core loop of the fight continues. That said, though I don't enjoy this moment, the fight does need it to maintain the overall pace the encounter uses of the demons swapping between the burnt out and aggressive modes. This first phase, where one demon is active and the other is inactive, is my favorite duel battle in the entire series. The attacks are clear, polished, and still dangerous, using lengthy tells to allow for the player to handle the chaos, but keeping the risk of all the attacks high enough that the fight never feels like it's compromising in its difficulty. The easiest way to dodge the attacks of the demons is to roll into their attacks, which also makes the interaction between a burnt out and melee aggressive demon interesting. Players can choose to go for the weaker demon that can't really do anything in return, only if they're willing to do more difficult dodges against the aggressive enemy, moving away from attacks that are designed to be easily dodged if you're rolling in. It works really well, and the fact that attacking the aggressive one is easier than the burnt out one interacts really well with the second phase's balancing act. Namely because the second half of the fight takes the concept of Ornstein and Smo to the absolute logical extreme. Whichever demon you killed second gets up after you kill it, and reignites brighter than before as the Demon Prince. The Demon Prince takes the fundamentals of the aggressive demon's moveset and adds the kinds of flares that make a boss feel spectacular that are just frustrating in a 2-on-1 battle. He flies around, uses sweeping attacks and AoE effects on his slashes and slams that demand more precise dodging on the part of the player, while taking elements from the Toxic ranged attack to create these lava trails that cut the player off from portions of the arena. On top of that, based on what demon's body he's possessed, he gains a different ultimate spell. Either a long laser attack that is much harder to avoid but significantly rewards someone rolling in and punishing it, or a massive fireball that is much easier to avoid but much harder to punish. Based on your build or personal abilities, players might want different moves, and the flexibility and detailed design of the first phase makes choosing the primary attack of the demon interesting every time. Dark Souls 3 loves its endurance fights, and the Demon Prince does a fantastic job introducing the escalation of that idea that defines the Ringed City DLC. The bosses in this DLC demand constant attention, each of them possessing some of the series' longest health bars. The first phase, deciding what variation of the main boss you fight, makes the whole fight feel connected and lets tension escalate even without a cutscene. I find it absolutely baffling that none of the ideas from the Demon Prince's first phase returned in Elden Ring, a game filled to the brim with duel battles. When a carefully designed moveset proved that it is capable to almost completely remove frustration from such a famously frustrating archetype of battle, it is baffling that none of Elden Ring's battles even attempted something like this. The Demon Prince is a proof of concept that I desperately wish that not only From Software but multiple gaming companies look at and learn from designing these bosses in the future. The Demon Prince is an S-grade boss, and my favorite 2-on-1 battle in the series. It gets overshadowed by other bosses in this frankly incredible DLC, but it deserves the honorific for everything it accomplished. I'm going to lead this next fight with a rather important detail. I do not like PvP games, with fighting games being the one exception to that rule. And why do I like fighting games? there's a precision and equality inherent to the genre. When you start up a good fighting game, when players sit on that menu, they're following the same rules. There's no balancing act a game is playing behind stage, trying to provide advantages or disadvantages to make up for capabilities only one player has. Halflight, the Spear of the Church, is a PvP battle. Though the footage that I'm playing here will be the offline version, so I can also discuss the designed NPC, I think the design of the battle in general represents where this battle fails as a PvP encounter for me. First, before even getting to the fight, you have to wait through this long monologue from a giant. I understand this is to cover load times as a player is summoned in, but it's very boring. Eventually, though, the giant summons in a mob, and my god, these are some of the most annoying mobs in this series. The Painted Guardians are fast enough that they frequently roll out of attacks, they have enough health that non-optimized builds cannot burst them down, and once there starts to be multiple enemies, they'll start healing themselves and the others around them. You combine that with incredibly fast melee combos and ranged attacks, and also you only have about 10 seconds before a player is going to arrive in your game, or, in the case of the footage, an NPC. In Dark Souls 3 and all the From Software games, weapons and spells are designed for PvE first, PvP second. Most notably seen in the list of debuffs certain abilities receive exclusively in PvP to try and account for balance. Because of this, anyone who likes PvP enough to want to become a boss and block players out of some of the best content of the game will almost exclusively be using equipment and spells well built or at least well prepared for PvP, whereas a normal player might not be. Players can come in with glass cannon builds designed to abuse the power of the Painting Guardians, hiding behind them and one-shotting when the player tries to eliminate the mobs, or waiting for the automatic spells like homing missiles to appear and take back tempo at no cost. The invading player may not be able to heal with Estus, but if the boss protects their guardians, who are, again, really difficult to kill, they can continuously heal your boss. The player's only solution is to create a PvP build so that your enemy can't stall you out. And that's assuming you even have the internet connection to make a PvP fight work, rather than a lagged out series of attacks that'll hit you when you're nowhere nearby. If you don't have good internet, or you don't have a PvP build ready and set to go, you've got to go online. Because this deep into the game, the only people you're going to summon in here will be spec'd for PvP and they will wreck you. On top of that, a second Painting Guardian shows up when the invader is at half health, which means that if the first Guardian does nothing but run away at the start of the fight, then you can have two mobs healing each other and another player while they're all stun locking you. But even if you go offline, the fight doesn't fare well. Halflight, the offline version of the Spear of the Church battle, is one of the most aggravatingly designed NPC fights in the game. It is telling that this battle is considered one of the hardest on a Soul Level 1 playthrough. Halflight has an insane poise and can swap weapons and hit you with something unpredictable so fast that the best way to fight him at low levels is to just cheese his AI with Pontiff's Greatsword. Halflight has a bow and a katana that he swaps instantly between, and the speed that he bursts out damage, especially combined with the Guardians, can lead to some insanely fast deaths. On return playthroughs, Halflight's cheap weapon swapping into fast attacks are so imbalanced that I die more to him than I do to the rest of the game. Except maybe the Crystal Sages, but again, that's a whole other personal story. Halflight should not be able to switch weapons faster than Maria changes her weapon forms in Bloodborne. I really do not like Halflight as an NPC, and the battle itself earns an F grade both on and offline. Online, the deck is stacked too far against the player, and the advantage of having more Estus doesn't mean much against two high aggression mobs and a player that will almost universally have more skill. Offline, meanwhile, the battle is a balancing nightmare that gives the same benefits to a badly designed NPC. I understand why they brought back the PvP fight from Demon Souls. It was iconic, and it's great to see it returned back here for the big final DLC of Dark Souls, but I really hate the fact that it locks the next two bosses, both of which I adore, behind it. This should have been an optional boss in the DLC. That's my hot take. Darkeater Midir is the dragon boss, not just in FromSoft games. Midir is the image cemented in my mind when someone talks about dragons in video games. Calamite, Sin, the King of the Storm, all of these were stepping stones, concepts that led designers to this encounter, which serves as one of their most impressive fights against a large enemy. As you may have noticed, there is a pattern that a lot of my really high grades often go to more humanoid opponents, with Ludwig's unique humanoid mimicking design being one big exception to the rule. Big enemies in this series have a ton of design problems they have to overcome that humanoids don't. Uncooperative camera angles, attacks with messier hitboxes, and animations that struggle to communicate to the player exactly what they have to be dodging. Though humanoids can struggle from these problems, the size of certain bosses makes designing around them uniquely difficult. It's a lot easier to animate a clear attack from a knight than it was for, say, the ancient dragon. Midir does suffer from some of these problems, particularly if you fight him in any way other than the dev-intended solution. But when you follow the developer's unspoken instructions, Midir is one of the tightest large boss battles in the series. The first thing to note is that Midir hits like an absolute semi-truck, often two-shotting a late-game character. Out of this DLC, Midir took the most tries for me to beat my first time, but was the boss I could most reliably dodge at the end. When I did my Soul Level 1 run, Midir was the easiest boss in the DLC. That's because Midir, more than any other boss in Dark Souls 3, demands you learn exactly how to dodge each and every one of his attacks in the exact way that allows you to damage him. To damage Midir, you'll be targeting his head. The rest of his body does take damage, but it takes significantly less, and attacks that hit underneath him are much more difficult to react to than the attacks that attack in front of him. Midir also takes a note out of the King of Storms books. If you target his head enough throughout the fight, you'll get a stagger that gets rid of a massive amount of his health bar, and I mean a massive amount. The first time I won this battle, I had assumed I'd lost. I had no Estus, and he was just below half health. But when that stagger all but killed him, the sudden rush of hope drove me to one of my most memorable kills ever, which I sadly don't have footage of. Standing in front of Midir also encourages a much more controlled camera, which means Midir's very well telegraphed and animated moves are all very clear to read. The hitboxes last just long enough that every dodge feels like you barely avoided it before going back in to hit him again, and his fire breath is usually easier to see the borders of than many of the other similar attacks in this series so far. The one issue is that the fight does not age quite as well as some of the other best battles in the series. Since there is a definitive correct answer to every attack, and the entire fight is about making sure you are able to perform that answer accurately, there isn't much room for expression within the fight. Any successful footage fighting Midir is going to look pretty close to identical. With that said, I think Midir still earns an A grade, and is an astonishingly designed fight. The lack of expression in a game so filled with it does hold him back, but Midir does such a great job taking ideas from the best and worst dragons in the series and honing it into one distilled experience. It feels strange to talk about Slave Knight Gael as the penultimate boss in this list, but I have a format for these videos and I'm sticking to it. Miyazaki has mentioned before that the Dark Souls series, so far as he is concerned, is done after Dark Souls 3. There will be more Souls-like games, like Sekiro and Elden Ring, but this was designed to be the final boss, not of the DLC, but of the Dark Souls series. This was the ending of everything, and it does what so few endings in media accomplish. It satisfies. Slave Knight Gael is the one who pulled you into the first DLC to fight Sister Friede. He could even be summoned for that fight even when you weren't embered. Slave Knight Gael led you through the start of the Ringed City DLC with his infamous messages, left everywhere that an otherwise impossible jump is required. Take the plunge, you won't die. And then, as you travel forward to the end of time, bad item touch again, by the way, one more time, when the world is nothing but ash, you find a beast consuming the last living things in the world. Gael. Distorted and monstrous, hungry and demanding your soul. And with that, the final battle begins. The atmosphere here is incredible. This arena is massive, and despite the hills and verticality, I've never had an issue with Gael clipping into structures or the floor. His moveset is distilled down to the basics of a sword fight. Dashes, slashes, and a big combo that leaves him wide open for punishment, but does a massive amount of damage if you fail to escape. Gael is also one of the only endurance fights in this game that uses a single health bar. Lothric and Lorian constantly refill their health bar, the Nameless King gets a whole new one halfway through, Sister Friede has 3 of them, and the Demon Prince has 2, 3 if you count the fact that there's 2 demons at the start. The only other exception to this rule is Midir, who has a huge chunk of his health bar removed by the Visceral attack. Gael has a tank's health bar, and there's no shortcuts. He is an honest wall. Once you get him about 30% of the way down, you get the big transition cutscene. His blood falls onto his sword, he title drops the game and abandons the feral posture. His first phase is really solid, but this second and third phase is where this fight becomes something astonishing. Every attack here is immaculately designed. Every spin, every flying dash, using his crossbow or miracles for ranged attacks, everything feels and looks incredible. His cape follows up with this small chip damage after every attack, encouraging perfect positioning and staying in close, yet not over-punishing it. Even with his mobility, he rarely, if ever, backs away from the player for long. You are always pressed face to face with him, and even when you aren't, he's throwing something at you, pulling out his crossbow to fill you with bolts. The only way to win is to learn how to navigate this relentless assault and punish him. On top of this, he still staggers every 4 or so hits, which makes him still feel like a person even in this enhanced state. Going into Phase 3 doesn't have another cutscene, but it certainly continues to escalate the tension. Souls burst out of his body, and when each hits the ground, it summons a lightning bolt. Beyond adding a little more situational awareness, this doesn't change the fight too much significantly more, but it does look absolutely incredible as this storm of bolts begins to cover the arena, and it's not just for show, these are actual damaging bolts on top of everything he's doing. And if that wasn't enough, he starts pulling out his crossbow mid-sword swing to shoot a couple of bolts. The timing on the dodge may not change, but failing to dodge or dodging a couple frames off starts to be punished a little bit more, and a successful dodge looks so incredible and feels so satisfying to pull off as you duck under the first attack, dodge out of the way of these crossbow bolts, and then dodge another one. It's just so cool. Slave Knight Gael is not just an S-grade boss, but he is my favorite boss fight in the Dark Souls Trilogy. He takes every element from the best bosses in the series and combines them all here. The moveset of Artorias, the style of the Burnt Ivory King, the transformation elements of Ludwig, and the general spectacle of Dark Souls 3 is escalated to a logical apex. I'm not sure if I prefer Ludwig or Gael, it often varies day to day, but if what Miyazaki said is true, if this is the end of Dark Souls, then Gael is the kind of final love letter that every piece of media deserves. He's a love letter to the series' history, to its players, and to that fair but demanding challenge the series brought into the mainstream. Now, the soul of Cinder may seem simple compared to the spectacle of Gael, but as the final boss of the main game of Dark Souls 3, the soul of Cinder does incredibly well, bringing the story of the series to a satisfying conclusion. But to talk about the soul, we have to, for one more boss, talk about the story of Dark Souls told as quickly and efficiently as possible. Once upon a time, Gwyn found a fire, and it was a pretty nice fire. His kingdom succeeded because of that fire. Then the fire started going out, so Gwyn did what any logical person would do and threw himself into the fire, and he burned alive for a while. Then the fire started going out again, namely because there was no more Gwyn left to burn, and so Dark Souls happened. The player then either lights themselves on fire, which helps for a little while, or they took over the world, at which point the fire kept going out until someone inevitably killed the Dark Lord and then lit themselves on fire. Dark Souls 2 probably happens somewhere in this loop here, but that's not relevant right now. The point is that this whole cycle continues for a long while as the world shifts and adjusts, with more and more people lighting themselves on fire, until eventually it's Lothric's turn to light himself on fire, and he decides, nah, he's not gonna do it. Then Dark Souls 3 happens, you kill a bunch of people, and you eventually arrive at the first flame to either light yourself on fire or put out the fire, maybe for good this time. It's Dark Souls, we just get broad strokes here. The point is, the first flame wants to make sure that you're really fit for being lit on fire, but unlike the first game, where Gwyn was able to defend it, you've already murdered everybody important in the world, so the first flame creates the Soul of Cinder. The Soul of Cinder is the being that brought you back to life in the introduction cutscene, and now you have to fight it to gain access to the flame. Once you understand the backstory, this moveset really comes together. In the first phase, the Soul of Cinder has 4 modes that it swaps between randomly: Mage, Cleric, Pyromancer, or Warrior. Each of these different modes use common builds, spells, and abilities that players have had access to within the Dark Souls series. The Warrior uses a longsword, swinging with classic attacks. Pyromancers do the flip that the Darkwood Grain Ring gives you in Dark Souls, and uses Combustion, Fire Orb, and Poison Mist while wielding a scimitar. The Cleric uses a long spear and shield, using charge weapon arts from this game, and miracles that throw lightning and heal between his attacks. The Mage, meanwhile, uses the homing soul mass spell, the soul arrows, and that big Dragon Ball Z laser beam that you've seen in all the Elden Ring videos, and will occasionally bonk you with the staff. If you couldn't tell by every single time I've complimented it in the series, I really like it when bosses take the capability of a player and warp the animations to work as boss attacks. It does a lot to make a boss feel real within the world, and also makes the player feel superior for winning with notably lesser tools. What's happening here in particular is you are fighting the builds of Dark Souls players. This is who succeeded every time after Gwyn. It's the players. You are fighting an embodiment of everyone who has ever played Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, which is just a really cool idea. Where the fight goes from a really fun conceptual battle against an enemy with an uncomfortably vast move pool to an amazing conclusion to the main story of a series is once his health is reduced to near zero. He does a big explosion and gets all his health back as the music drops away to a minimal version of Gwyn's theme, as the Soul of Cinder swaps to a familiar sword user using Gwyn's moveset. And the moveset that was once too fast in Dark Souls fits perfectly with the faster pace of this game. With Dark Souls 3's cinematic streak, the explosions of course have more flair, and a number of other attacks lean on a more cinematic nature as well. He now flings a lightning bolt into the air to bring bolts crashing back down on the player, and he has a multi-hit swing that's reminiscent of Manus' combo and ends with a final explosion. Everything feels so tight here. The music is gorgeous, and though it relies on knowledge of Gwyn's fight to really hit home exactly what's happening here, friends of mine who hadn't touched Dark Souls prior to Dark Souls 3 still felt the power of this theme and moveset. The weight present in this fight is really something special, because even if you don't know what's going on, which it's Dark Souls, you probably won't know what's going on at first, you can feel that this fight is something different, something really special. The Soul of Cinder earns yet another S grade, and I think embodies the better half of Dark Souls 3's use of nostalgia. At its worst, the nostalgia can be unimportant areas or corpses that make no sense to still be lingering somewhere. But at its best, it does things like this, taking ideas and concepts, the very concept of a game that has been played in multiple different ways, and modernizes, develops them into fights like this, creating an amazing sense of finality as you end the main story of Dark Souls. So, in case you hadn't somehow figured it out, I really like Dark Souls 3's bosses. Though it stumbles occasionally, as any game does, it consistently avoids mediocrity. When Dark Souls 3 goes for something, it makes these loud, cinematic, boisterous fights, each with so much detail slammed in. Completely insignificant fights like Dragonslayer Armour are always what I point to. The fight is completely unimportant, but is stuffed with so much detail that it stands out from other more important fights in the series. It's absolutely incredible what this game accomplished, and I think the smaller boss roster is to account for that. Prior to the DLC, there were only 19 bosses, and I think 11 of them are A grade or better. Dark Souls had some amazing boss fights, and Bloodborne's bosses had some ridiculously high moments. But I think in terms of pure roster, Dark Souls 3 has to be in the running within the FromSoft series for the best boss fights in terms of moveset, atmosphere, and presentation. The word that kept coming up as I wrote this script was this: tight. And that's exactly what every boss's design is here. That said, despite my adoration for this game, it is not my favorite From Software game. That title goes to the next game in the series that we're going over, Sekiro. Shadows Die Twice. So, for now, let this fire fade, and I'll see you all as From Software branches to what I believe to be their most unique game to date. Eventually, though, the Giant summons in a mob. Did I say Giant? Long fire breath attacks leave huge windows. Whoa, what was that?